writing program, Empowerment Avenue. So thank you all for joining us. Chris, can you still hear me?
Yeah,
okay.
For sure.
All right. So the idea for this panel actually came from work that I did with Jesse in the fall of 2021, where I was going with Jesse to teach journalism at the Folsom Women's Facility. And as Bernice noted, I've been covering incarceration for a while and understand the difficulties of doing that as someone who has access to most of the materials that I need, and I'm outside and I don't have to fear retaliation. But while we were at the prison, there were women who actually had some pretty incredible ideas, and there were things that I wish they would have been able to do, but they didn't have access to those materials. And we, for most of the time that we were teaching the class, had prison staff there with us, so there wasn't much privacy, and it was a very difficult situation, and it got me thinking about the challenges of creating journalism while you're incarcerated. And so I want to ask all of you, I'm going to start with Chris, since you're on the line now. How did you get your start in journalism? Like, what inspired you to become a journalist?
So I guess I got my start because I wanted to write a story about a friend who had joined a prison gang. He had joined a neo-Nazi prison gang, and we had grown up in, an impoverished community that was a black and brown community. And although he was white, he had never really lived around anybody like that, and I'd never heard any kind of racism or anything from him. So when I'd shown up in prison and I had seen like what he had become and kind of like how he had got swept up into the environment that prison kind of puts upon people, it blew my mind. And I wanted people to understand that prison often has a way of forcing people into choices they probably wouldn't naturally choose. And I wanted to tell that story, so in a way, and just kind of start to educate society around what I was seeing. So,
thank you. Jesse?
So my beginning into journalism, I think it happened by accident. I used writing more as a way of chronicling my day-to-day events. And eventually, when I got to San Quentin, I got recruited for the newspaper, and that's where I got my voice. But my passion for storytelling started, just because of being raised in the carceral system. You go through this emotional and psychological roller coaster every year when elections come around, because you get your hopes up that there might be a release date coming in the future. Especially being incarcerated as a juvenile with multiple life sentences, there was no outlet for me to share those stories and that type of stress. So I started writing, and then I understood eventually that journalism is the first account of human history. So eventually, right, if my writings pop up, if I were to die, then there's a recollection of what was actually taking place in my mind at that time. Eventually, I wanted to use journalism as a way to advocate for my community. In the prison system in California, we're race and gang segregated, and there's a bigger issue than just the conditions of confinement. There's a culture that keeps us in darkness, and that darkness is there because of the lack of information, the lack of access to newspapers or publications, and the lack of news, particularly of what's important to somebody who's incarcerated. So that's why I got into journalism.
Yeah, like Jesse, I fumbled into journalism. When I was sentenced to 55 to life, I was like, man, my life is over, but that's no excuse to die a loser. So I thought of writing because my voice was still free. And so I figured if I could write a book that was so good and so powerful, it would make the New York Times bestseller list. People in my neighborhood would drop their guns. People would understand systematic issues, and we address the symptoms. We address the root causes instead of the symptoms. And so I started writing, and I wrote for 10 years, and I wrote this book that was pretty horrible. It was it was 250,000 words of jibber jabber, but I didn't have any training. And so finally I got lucky and I made it to San Quentin State Prison, which is the first prison I've ever been to with opportunities. They had a college on the campus, on the prison compound. They had a creative writing class, and they had the San Quentin News. And so I picked San Quentin. I went to all three of them, but I was going to San Quentin News because they let me use my own computer. And I figured I can get my book on the computer and put it in some kind of digital format. And when I want to make changes, I don't have to type them out. And so I got into the newsroom as a scam. but I fell in love with it. I learned how to write, and I got so caught up in journalism, I never finished the book.
So I want to ask if there are particular things that when both of you were incarcerated and writing, and Chris, for you, are there specific things that you chose to cover and specific topics that you chose to avoid? And Jesse, can start with you.
Oh, that's a good question. So just a bit of background on me. So former gang member, going into the prison system, there's a lot of groups and sectarianism, primarily when it comes to the Southern Hispanics. I'm originally from down south. So the Mexican Mafia has a strong hold upon the carceral system. So there's certain things that we don't touch on. Like, we learned how to talk like if you were in a courtroom. So I learned how to lose allegedly before I became a journalist. I learned if at the reception tonight you ask me a question, I may respond, I may or may not know. And the best one that you learn is, I don't recall.
Oh, the SEALs use that one a lot.
Exactly. So one of the things that I chose to stay away from in particular was, prison politics and gang politics in particular, primarily because, I realized early on in my incarceration that the sense of safety is only an illusion. Like, it doesn't matter what kind of protections you may think you have inside of the carceral system, like anybody can get killed. And I realized that there's no way, like even when we're trying to do something for the good of our people, it's always seen as bad. I'll give you an example so that you can understand the context. In 2004, we had a riot with the officers in Calipatria State Prison. Everybody went on lockdown. We got thrown in the hole. 2 years later, there was a federal investigation where a bunch of officers were accused of, a lot of beatings and stuff. During that riot, I had been in shackles and handcuffs for 13 hours in the sand. So from 9 in the morning in 115-degree weather, they had us in shackles and chains until like 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning the next day. So that brought on a federal, oversight committee. They came in, they started interviewing everybody. We couldn't say anything. We couldn't say anything because that's prison policy. Like, the incarcerated, even if you're testifying against an officer, even if you're testifying against the government, you can't because you get killed. The only guy who testified was killed like 2 weeks afterwards. So that's how bad it is, and that's like the mindset that I had. So mind you, this was in 2004. I had just been in the system 4 years. I came in at 17, and by the time I realized, like, I want to be a journalist, I already had a mindset. There are certain things that I will not touch on because I value my life. So the things that I focused on were more about, policies, prison changes, administrative changes, and like profiles of people that were making a difference in our community inside.
Rahsaan?
Yeah, for me, there were a lot of stories I just weren't interested in, right? I feel like TMZ or other organizations, not even TMZ, but just different organizations cover the bleeds it leads type stuff, the locked up type mentality about prison. And so I wanted to, like, once I learned, like, what was wrong with me, what was wrong with society and what needs to change, that's the things I wanted to cover. I wanted society to learn and really be solution orientated. But there's also like this weird balance when you work, when you do journalism from within a prison, and the prison is allowing you to like learn journalism and use their computers, and you have this weird thing where they allow you to kind of be a little bold.
The caller has hung up.
But at the same time, not to be too bold because like they can't stop you from freedom of speech, but they can pull a plug on your operation. And so there's definitely times I pull punches. You hear things about COs or wardens or captains. And you know not to touch those stories because they allow you to do all this great stuff, and you know that you have to maintain this balance. And so you pull your punches a little bit. But you try to be as bold as you can. And honestly, though, I'm really more focused on, like, I'm not about punishment or retribution or look at what he did. I'm like, let's just forget all that, man, and just fix this thing. And that's the kind of stories I want to cover.
And what do those stories look like? Like, what do the stories look like where you think you can create change?
Ooh, so I don't know if I can create change. I can try. So I have all the answers. I just don't know how to get anybody to listen. So one of the things like gun violence, right? It pisses me off when I see like a senator.
An incarcerated individual at Washington Correction Center. This call is not private. It will be recorded and may be monitored. If you believe this should be a private call, please hang up and follow facility instructions to register this number as a private number. To accept this free call, press 1. To refuse this free thank you. Securus. You may start the conversation now.
Sorry. Hi, Chris.
Yeah. When I see Bobby.
Sir, go ahead. Go ahead, son.
When I see stories about gun violence in schools, gun violence in the neighborhoods, and when they bring on experts or people to talk about it, it's like some senator guy or a victim of gun violence, and I'm like, you got to talk to the experts. You got to talk to people who've been shot, who shot people and have changed, and now are trying to stop violence, and are actually pretty good at it. Wherever there's violence reduction people, violence goes down like 19%, right? And it's not even fully funded or supported or promoted. So imagine if you really talk to people with real solutions and allow us really to really get out there and do these things. So stories like that, just all kinds of stories like that. When I hear about just all the hate and just all the misconceptions of like what it means to be incarcerated. Like for instance, they think that if you commit certain crimes, you're evil. And I'm not going to say evil doesn't exist, but it's very rare. Maybe we need one prison to lock them all up, right? But everybody else is traumatized, bought into a stupid culture and fell for the peer pressure, drug addicted. And if we cure the culture, if we cure the trauma, if we cure the drug addiction, we have 95% of our people be solid and contribute to America in a real positive way.
So, Chris, I want to start with you with this question. What are some of the biggest challenges you faced in practicing journalism while incarcerated?
I mean, the biggest thing, right, is we have a lack of resources, right? Like, so it's hard to do a lot of reporting. It's hard to find the material that we would need to stay active, and especially when you're doing investigative journalism, because it's quick, it's fast sometimes, especially if you're doing a breaking story. So I mean, we need to be able to have access to research materials and things like that. And without the internet, that can get pretty dicey. I mean, I haven't even sent a text message in my life or ever touched the internet. So for me, like, those things are completely inaccessible. And then it's like getting publishers, you know, to give us a chance, right? To know that we can tell the story and that we're like part of this culture, that from the inside that we are the experts, right? Like, we're the ones that have a PhD in this and understanding the carceral system and what happens in the system and how we end up in the system. You know, so finding that and getting those opportunities to be the ones that are actually telling those stories, you know, and that's hard. So, and being looked at as an equal as a journalist. Right? Like, a lot of the times we don't get that opportunity to be looked at as an equal, like a journalist in the free world, because we're incarcerated, and that we couldn't tell those stories in a proper way. But so I think, you know, with that lack of resources and that like constant ability of having to fight for our right in this space, for our ability to stand in this space, you know, it becomes difficult. But I think that's also what makes us strong in this and gives us the tenacity to do it in a strong way, right?
Yeah, so one of the questions, because Rahsaan, you were talking about this as well. How are you all seen when you talk about people not giving you a chance and not seeing you as being the same or equal to journalists who aren't incarcerated? What do you mean? Like, what are some of the things that you're experiencing? And Chris, I guess.
I think we're seen as a source, right? We're seen as a source a lot of the time. So a lot of the time when reporters reach out, you know, that's been my interactions before, you know, I was writing it and had a platform, is I was seen as someone that could be giving the story to somebody as a source, opposed to someone who could tell the story from my own angle, right? Many of us are seen as undereducated and people that might not be able to tell the story as strongly as someone on the outside and whatnot. So I think when you have that, it's kind of like we're going in as an underdog, you know.
Rahsaan?
Yeah, I think two obstacles we faced that I faced when I was inside is one, the weight of incarcerated people is less than CDCR, right? So every time I'm messing with an organization from the outside, they want to fact check, and they'll check with CDCR, and whatever CDCR says, they'll go with that. But if I say 5 incarcerated people said this, they want to see the notes, they want to, I mean, it's like we don't have the same level of credibility, and I don't know why. CDCR be lying like a mother sucker. The other issue we ran into too is like a lot of big organizations They asked us to write for them, but they asked for opinion pieces. But I'm working with that. I feel like, once you see we can write, we'll get past the opinion. John Lennon did it. He got past the opinion section of the New York Times and made it like regular reporting. And so I'm taking it as an entry-level position. I'm trying to be nice about it, but really it's an insult. Because we write. We good at this. Like, let us go.
So in journalism, there is the notion of objectivity and not being able to be objective when you're covering a community that is your own. And so what do you think of that notion as it applies to you being incarcerated, covering people who are incarcerated? I don't know who wants to go.
First of all, there's no such thing as objectivity. That's a myth, right? We can stop. And so when you say objectivity, what you really mean is being professional. And I could be professional even with prison blues on. So that's bullcrap, right? And I think that we miss the fact that when you're embedded in the community, you are the best source because you're an expert. Like a journalist that covers stuff over and over again becomes an expert on that. And you see them on the news shows every morning. They talk like a source because they talk to so many people. They're so embedded in that community. They know who's who and who's what. I'm on the yard. You talk to Pookie. You think Pookie telling you the truth. I know Pookie bullshitting you. Excuse my language. You know what I mean? I know who's who, what's what. So I'm better suited to get the facts out. And so all I need to do to be objective is be professional. But and then none of that, like you're not connected. You know how many stories with this objectivity bullcrap they get wrong because they have no connection to my community. They don't know who to talk to. And the other thing that pisses me off, this might be a tangent, but I keep seeing, I know that bleeds it leads stuff, and I think that's why they do it. But they'll accept a press release from the police or CDCR and run with it. And with anybody else, they always, at least your job is to speak truth to power, get both sides of the story. But when it comes to system-impacted people, they don't even know. Chris got a tablet. You can call him now and still make your deadline and get an expert opinion from inside. Mm-hmm. But they settle for these one-sided press releases, and that's bullcrap. And so we could do better.
Yeah, so I think the other thing, too, that factors into a lot of that, at least from what I saw, is so our community has specific needs, and I understand reporting on the outside, it's about serving our communities. So for us, like San Quentin News is specifically for the incarcerated community. Back before we actually had a state publication, right, like our newspaper was only distributed inside of San Quentin. So it made sense for that, right? And then the Logan brothers came in and lend their name and support. So then the state was like, hey, you know what? Well, they got some support from some credible sources. Let's help them expand into all these facilities. What that did for us as a community was it gave us a voice and a platform. See, because mainstream media, what they care about is not what matters to us. I don't care about gas prices. I don't care about milk prices. Inflation does not affect me. So, like, what matters to me? So I understand, so there's a difference, right? Because Rahsaan and Empowerment Ave, they're doing great in terms of getting the word out on mainstream media about what incarceration life is like. But for us on the inside, imagine individuals with multiple life sentences with no hope, in darkness, with no information, no accessibility to resources. What do you give them? And all of a sudden, right, here comes this newspaper that's giving them some hope, some highlight of what's possible within a system in spite of the sentence that you have. That's how I got there. Like, that's my story. That's why I'm passionate about what I do. I went to San Quentin not because, there was two reasons why I went to San Quentin. I ain't gonna lie, right? So number one, I read the newspaper, and remember, I had been raised in this carceral system since the age of 13. All I knew was nothing about being a gang member. That's all I knew. I didn't care about rehabilitation, but you know what? I saw two stories in the paper that impacted my life. Number one was I saw this college program on the top of the fold. So everybody who's seen the print newspaper, you know what's on top of the fold, right? Front page, the college program, right? I'm like, dang, I want to go there. I want to go check it out. Number two, at the bottom, though, when I opened it, I saw these college girls playing tennis on the prison yard. And I was like, they lying. They're lying. I had to go check it out for myself. That's when my career in investigative journalism began. I got there, and you know how much mail we've gotten from individuals across the state of California. After they get the newspaper, right, and they see former gang members, whether it's a Sureño, a Norteño, a Blood, a Crip, whoever, and they see them graduating, they see them accomplishing something, they're like, man, there's hope for us. And that's the thing, right? Like, we're working, two sides of the same front, right? Number one is we have to change societal perspectives on who we are, right? Like, that narrative has to be balanced. And number two, we also have to change the prison culture, because for a lot of us, we don't see our own worth until somebody sees it in us. So I think, like, that's part of the mission that we have, right, as prison journalists, for if our audience is the inside. For the outside, it's totally a different message.
Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about the threat of retaliation. And Chris, I want to start with you, because this is something that when we were setting up this panel, obviously Chris is in a prison, and I was concerned about him speaking on the panel and having to deal with retaliation. And so, Chris, can you talk a little bit about how, as you're reporting, have you had to deal with retaliation, and if so, from whom?
Well, I'm going to have to be careful because I have two guards that are standing at my door right now, and they're kind of watching what I say. So, no. I guess, like, at the end of the day, it's just like, and it's like what I was telling you before. A reporter that goes and reports in a country that's in a war-torn country, they go and do it because it's their duty to talk about the harms that are being caused there. And I think it's the same thing when you're in prison. Like, if no one's going to tell the real story, if no one's going to be honest and educate society about what's going on in here, then we're never going to have this story about why a lot of people get out and recidivate, why a lot of people don't get out with the tools that they have, right? So it just comes down to, you just got to do what you know is right. And if that comes with some form of retaliation, then you just have to accept that as it goes along. And you move and continue to do what you know is on your path. And I feel like, a lot of us that step up in this space, like, once we realize that and are able to move on that path in that way, then it becomes easier, right? And also, like, the bigger your platform, the less they want to retaliate, right? So they don't want to retaliate against someone that has a very solid platform. They do call us liars a lot, though. So, I don't think that ever stops. We're always considered that we're not telling the truth. But, I just think that there's always the aspect of retaliation in life for almost any direction or anything that you do. But for me, at the end of the day, if we're doing the right thing and we're fighting for a just cause, and I can look in the mirror and I feel comfortable with what I'm doing, then it really doesn't matter what their plan is or what they're going to do to retaliate. The more of us that do this, the better chance we have of them not being able to do that. The more of the narrative we change, the better off we are. So someone's got to step up. Someone's got to do it. And, many did it way before I did it. And it's just about us grabbing the baton and doing the same work and being willing to sacrifice for the greater good of the work that we're doing. And that's healing our communities and humanizing the individuals that are behind these walls and these fences.
Are there any stories that you've worked on, though, where you have had to deal with retaliation?
Over COVID, it was pretty dicey because DOC actually had a real ability to be able to just kind of do whatever they want. They could just take you to the hole and be like, oh, you were around someone that had COVID today. And next thing you know, you're sitting in the hole for 3 weeks trying to figure it out. But, at the end of the day, I couldn't really tell you, like, if that's why it was. I know that I was writing stories. I know that I was exposing what was going on. And I know that I was sitting in solitary confinement multiple times because of it, probably. So, yeah.
Is this something that you all want to have either of you had to deal with retaliation for stories you've done?
Now, I can tell you about Juan Haynes, though.
Yeah.
Because Juan Haynes has gotten himself into quite a few conundrums. So Juan Haynes is the senior editor for San Quentin News. He also works with Solitary Watch and a lot of other publications, and he's always seemed to get on the transfer list, because he pushes the envelope. But the one thing that got him into, like, a lot of hot water was when Legionnaires struck at San Quentin. Like, there was, like, this Legionnaires outbreak and stuff, and Juan decides to jump on the phone. It wasn't a story that came out on San Quentin News. He wanted to get it out on the mainstream, media. So he calls a reporter, and they recorded Juan on the state phone talking about, this is Juan Haynes, San Quentin News, live on the scene. And it was like, oh, man. Like, I heard the recording because Lieutenant Robinson let us listen to it. And it was like, oh, dude, what'd you do? He's like, yeah, he's on the bus. He's going to get transferred. And it's like, why? Because he's breaking a story? And the whole thing is, it was because Juan was getting ahead of, like, the state narrative that they wanted to put out first. They wanted to be the first one to break the news before anyone on the inside was able to get the story out. And I think that's part of the problem, as Rahsaan was saying, that sometimes, when reporters get a press release, they lend it a lot of weight. And then if we come back and try to refute it or rebuttal it, then it's like, well, we don't carry enough weight because of the credibility thing. So Juan had to go through that. I didn't have to go through that with the police. I had to go through that with the skinheads. So I had written a story about this transformation that was happening at San Quentin. Remember when they were transferring everybody and making it a non-designated facility? So they were switching it from a general population facility into a non-designated, which means that they were going to integrate everybody from every gang, every case factor, whatever. And this was going to happen in the beginning of 2018. I decided to write a story about the policy changes that were taking place, just to let people know, like, hey, I'm bringing awareness. This is what's going to take place. Well, I had a couple skinheads after the paper came out in print. They came to the newsroom, and I was like, what's up? They were asking for me. We went outside, and they're like, man, you're going to get killed. Why'd you write that story and stuff? And it was because if you have a prison gang reputation and other people know that you're in one of these facilities, all of a sudden you become a target. And because they felt that I made them a target, they wanted me to be a target now too. So that type of like misunderstanding, and I chalk it up to literacy, right? It's like, I know that sounds harsh, right? But a lot of folks that read the paper sometimes don't understand what they're reading. There's a difference between a journalist telling you what's going to happen versus him endorsing what's taking place. And we have a lot of those assumptions that take place in the carceral system. Luckily for me, as you can see, nothing happened. I'm still here. But yeah.
Yeah, I never really directly experienced retaliation. But like Chris said, like retaliation doesn't come with like, we're doing this to you because you did this story. It's like your mail disappears, your visit gets canceled. It becomes excuses, so you're never really sure. And then going back to Juan Haynes, he's the boldest journalist from prison I've ever seen. He writes stories I'm scared to touch. And he's on a collect call phone that's monitor recorded, talking hella crap about CDCR. And one thing I would say, we both went to the board the same year. I went with a homicide and a history of violence. He went with robbing a bank with a note. He got hit at the board. I'm home. And so I don't know if that has anything to do with his journalism, but I know if I'm home, why isn't he?
Yeah.
Actually, he's 5'2" and he's 60-something. He's not a danger to society.
Yeah.
Unless his pen is a threat.
Which it is. It is. So you all have talked about the journalism that is done by people who have no direct experience with being incarcerated, and how they take the word of the Department of Corrections, or they don't necessarily report in the way that you think they should. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, what should...
Ooh, I got example. Somebody on blast right now.
Don't name any names.
Oh.
Go ahead.
There's one newspaper. This one California newspaper printed a letter from a prosecutor. And this prosecutor was saying that she tried to stop this and tried to do that and tried to do this. And her claims were preposterous. Like, if anybody that knows this, like, she actually said she wrote the parole board and tried to keep somebody from being released.
You have 1 minute left.
And this guy wasn't going before a parole
The caller
board.
has hung up.
The parole board had no power to stop to keep this guy in prison. He had a determinate date and he was going home. She was also talking about Prop 57, which I think is it's flawed, but it's one of the best things that happen in California, because the recidivism rate for people who heal, people who take the groups, the programs, the therapy, is 2%. The recidivism rate for people who don't is 47%, right? And the difference is the people with the 47%, they have dates. They don't have to do anything but do their time and go home. But Prop 57 is like, well, if you take these groups we'll take some time off. So now they have a motivation to change. Now the flowing is that they'll take any group. They're chrono chasing. They won't. That noble counselor saying this is what you need to meet your needs. This is what you need to take to get time off. They just take anything. But they report about Prop 57 in a way that was really unintelligent and like going against Prop 57 when it could be fixed. But it's the best thing that ever happened to California in the prison system right now. And so they just didn't know what they were talking about. It was one-sided. And they just went with this letter from a prosecutor. That's like promoting prosecution. Like, what are they doing?
So, but it was a letter. It wasn't a story.
It was a story they made from her letter.
Yeah. So there's a couple.
One second. I'm giving it too much grace calling it a story.
Yeah.
It's a reprint of a letter. They called it a story. Maybe I don't know.
Yeah, so along those lines, right, especially with Prop 57 and all these criminal justice reform changes in California, I think the one thing that when it comes to reporting on the criminal justice system, like people always isolate today's event from its historical context.
Right.
Like they divorce it from its reality, right? When you look at like crime rates today, they're at historically low rates. Like if you look at the numbers. But most reporters, right, because I don't know where they were trained, but it wasn't the J school here at Berkeley. Most reporters, right, unfortunately, they just like take the story in today's context. Like, here's what's happening today. Here's what the crime rate is today, right? And it's like, well, you can't divorce anything at all from its historical context. If you do that, then you have a warped story that you're working with. And fact-checking is like a big thing. If you can't get a hold of an incarcerated person to get their side of the story, it doesn't matter. You should be able to fact-check, through the numbers. There are state systems where you can pull comp stats, you can pull reports. Like this whole week, right, we haven't had one story other than the one rapper who got killed at Soledad. But we've had 3 murders in the past 4 days in California prisons. But only one got reported because I think his name was Money Schwade something out of Los Angeles. 22-year-old kid gets killed in the shower at Soledad, and that's the only story that came out on TMZ Hip Hop. It didn't make any news outlets other than that. So they took the state press release, and that's all they did. They didn't follow up with like anybody in the carceral system. They didn't call the prison to get a statement. Like, how is it that somebody gets killed at 7 at night, you don't find the body till 10:30 at night when you run count? Like, he wasn't even in his cell. So some of these things, right, and that's like criminal negligence. So if you want to talk about like what's the thread that you can follow, it's like, yeah, there's a dead body here 4 hours after or 2 hours after count, because count is at 9 o'clock, and like you can follow this to criminal negligence, but nobody's going to do that. And I'll tell you why. Here's the other thing, right? When it comes to being biased in our country, right, the incarcerated are low-hanging fruit. Like, that's a sad reality. There's pockets in our communities that care, and they'll care for a little bit. Maybe after this panel's done, you might forget when we hit that reception. Like that's the reality, that once things are outside of your, like vision, out of sight, out of mind. So this is what tends to happen, right? We want to change the carceral system, but we don't want to spend the time doing that. And we don't want to dig deep into like the systemic issues that perpetuate that system. We do prison journalism inside, and we highlight stories that we want the communities to hear about us because we know what the communities think about us. There's not one day that I'm not reminded of the systemic barriers that exist, the hurdles that exist, the things that are there systemically embedded in our laws that keep me from being able to like rent a house in certain counties, being able to get a certain loan, right? I can't even get like some meetings with some funders because, my background. They won't tell me that, but some of their grant officers will. And that's part of the problem, right? Why is it that my background has to be a hurdle that I have to overcome? And that's because of our societal perceptions. And if we really want to have that honest conversation, it starts with actually digging deep into the historical context of every story that we're telling when it comes to the incarcerated people and those systems that keep them there.
Can I add to that real quick?
Sure.
Yeah, that's one thing I want reporters to do differently, something called a power narrative check. Instead of just talking about what happened, let's dig deeper than that, right? Or for instance, the 3-strike law, right? It passed because of the press from a person on parole, killed the little girl. And the press was crazy. And so it made so much national press. And Bill Clinton started talking like, yeah, we need to do a 3-strike law. And all these states enacted it, right? But I don't know that guy. I don't know anything about him. But I know what prison was like back when he did his first 2 bids. Prison was barbaric. you don't go in there and get better. You come out worse. And so we got this law that was inhumane and was putting people in prison. Like still, there's a guy right now in prison right now for selling weed in prison. He got struck out. Another guy met with a roach. I mean, guys got stuck in there, still in there right now this day. It's like 5 or 6,000 people on misdemeanors still stuck on a 3-strike law in prison right now because of the press generated for a story about a parolee, a person on parole that did something horrible, but nobody asked, like nobody looked at the prison system. How did you get out twice and be worse? Where was the interventions? What were the groups? What were the programs? What was going on in this person's life? Nobody asked those questions. Nobody indicted the prison system. Nobody investigated, what happened to him. They just looked at, oh, you evil, you did this, and you got out for the second time, and we're gonna make sure you never get out again, and that's gonna fix something. And so I really encourage journalists to do power narrative checks, to think deeper than the surface, think deeper than what happened, and ask why. Keep asking why. And when you ask why, stop asking why in the point of an oppressor and a colonizer. Stop asking why in a way that holds the people with the least power the most accountable. Let's start holding the people with the power the most accountable.
So I'd like to ask what you all need. You alluded to funders. You've all talked about access to information. What do you think is needed for people who are incarcerated to produce the kind of journalism that they would be able to with the right resources? And Chris, I'm going to start with you. Like, what would you need more of? Dream as big as you can.
I mean, to be able to do this work just like anybody out there and produce that same kind of quality work for a story is we need support, right? We need investors that want to invest in us. We need people that are willing to give us the resources and work with us and allow us to be part of this narrative and a part of telling these stories on a level that is possible like anybody on the outside. And that means giving us support, and that comes through often places that don't have any funding or anything like that. For me, that came through Empowerment Avenue, right? Through Emily and Rahsaan, and from them starting a path for some of us that are behind these walls to be able to tell these stories, right? And getting where other editorial places and publishers were falling short, they were picking up the ball and they were putting that resource in our hands so we could do that work, right? And they were the go-between. So I think that, we need to get that. We need to also, not have to constantly prove ourselves, right? Why do, like some of these guys have said earlier, why do I have to prove myself 10 times harder than anybody else that's out there telling a story? Why are we not believed as credible when we're living and experiencing this? So, we need the same opportunities. When we're telling stories, we don't need to be referred to as what we're in prison for or things like that. Like no other journalist out there is referred to the worst thing that they ever did in their life. We need to be respected as an equal and given those opportunities as an equal and not seen as something that's just a difficult or a struggle to work with, right? A hurdle. But we're not. We're the individuals that have the stories. We're more ethical than most of the journalists that tell some of these stories around incarceration, right? Because they're just feeding what the narrative is opposed to feeding what the real story is and talking about the harm that's really being caused. At the end of the day, majority of the people that are incarcerated, they were victims first, right? And that's how we led to this is through these environments. And I think people understanding that, that's how our story comes through. And for us to be able to change and make that transformation is exceptional. And when we do that, investing in us so we can continue to mentor others and do that, that's what we need. We need investment so we can show and continue that work and do the rehabilitation for our own people because nobody else is doing that in the prison system. We're going to do that.
Thank you. Jesse?
So I have 3 points on what we need, and I'll tell you why. The San Francisco Bay Area is great, and I'm glad that I went to San Quentin because I saw a couple of things that were transformative. The newspaper was there, but it was only in one prison. And like I said earlier, when Jonathan and Richard Logan came in, that was a game changer for us. it wasn't just because of the funding. It was because all of a sudden the prison administration saw that we had some notable, respected individuals that were supporting us. And they started taking notice of that. But it wasn't just that. See, the other dynamic to that was they stayed engaged. See, there hasn't been 1 year where Richard and Crystal hadn't visited the prison until COVID hit. Ever since they started investing, whether it was when Jonathan came in with Rosie, Mr. Robert Rosenthal, back in the days, like they've stayed engaged, and we have Berkeley students through Professor Drummond, Lisa goes in, we have visibility. We have reporters, we have professors, we have volunteers that come in on a daily basis. The prison system is less likely to retaliate when they see that type of community support. The funding is great to expand operations, but unless you have community engagement, especially reporters that are willing to expose a lot of that abuse that takes place inside the carceral system, us having accessibility to resources is not going to solve the problem unless we have community engagement so that there's other people that can actually advocate on our behalf. So that's like 2 points in one. And the third one is, visibility. Like help us reprint these stories and get them out there so that more people know, like, hey, there's people actually producing content. There's people telling powerful human stories. There's people highlighting these issues. There's people that are talking about the systemic issues that are embedded in our prison system, in our state laws, in our legislature, because our country is like in shambles when it comes to democracy. See, we can't vote. That's one thing that we haven't touched on. So the incarcerated in California hopefully will be able to get the right to vote, but across the country, there's this thing called felony disenfranchisement, where for the longest time, since the beginning of the Constitution, it has been embedded in there. If you catch a felony, if you go to prison, you cannot vote. You cannot participate in the democratic process, and yet you want us to feel a part of the community. So help us, highlight our voices and show that it does matter, that even if we can't vote, our families can, our communities can, and everybody else that can vote is voting on our behalf. Because at the end of the day, I think, if we're not going to be about second chances, and giving us the benefit of the doubt, then there's really no hope. And hope is the one thing that I learned in prison. That's your most valuable commodity as a person.
Clapping for yourself.
I need 4 things. I'm going to ask for the most. Number 1, Empowerment Avenue started as like a hobby. Thank God, Emily. I gave Emily a grant proposal. She took my grant proposal, never filed it, and just recruited a bunch of writers on the street and just started helping. Now we got funding to be part-time, but it became a full-time job. We need more people to do more support and like double our reach. Like right now we have 30 writers. We would love to double it to 60. We'd like to get more, to be able to do more. But even with that being said, right, I would also say fund type investigation, fund appeal, other people that help us do investigative journalism, not just us. Even with that, right, even we fully funded and I reached my goal of $700,000 a year and we operate at full capacity, we can't do it all. We need publications willing to learn how to work directly with incarcerated people and take us out. We don't want to be middlemen all the time. Like, holler at Chris Blackwell yourself. You know what I mean? Let us teach you how to do that. Let us teach you how to use GTL and global, all the stuff across the nation, the different systems. We have writers across the country, by the way. And so we need you to learn how to do this work with us, right? The third thing I would ask is every reporter should visit a prison. If you haven't been to a prison, don't talk about prisons, please. Do one or the other. Either stop talking about them or come check us out. Come meet us in person. And if you really want to help Empower Now, you can volunteer. And the last thing I would add, man, do power narrative checks when you do your stories. Call us people, not inmates. Just change how you do your business so that you fair. Inmate is a prison word. You're not objective if you're using that word, right? And right now, you have more credibility than we do. So until we balance that out, we need you to come see the truth, come be objective, which means be professional, which means stop calling a biased word and get both sides of the story and tell these stories right so we can make America great. Because there's never going to be nothing we divided and still working off stupidity.
Thank you. Questions or no? Thank you. So I'm going to open it up now for questions.
What's the most helpful thing that current San Quentin News volunteers could do?
The one thing I think, show up. One of the things that we have we have a lot of volunteers that come in. Every semester, Professor Drummond brings in all of his Berkeley students, so that's awesome. But we need consistency. You know, we need commitment. One of the things that we lack is like, we do something, you know, because it's either part of the course curriculum or because it's interesting for a couple months or a couple weeks, you know, but we need people that are in there for the long haul. So our volunteers that currently just retired, our youngest is 67, our oldest is 88, you know, which is awesome. We have retired volunteers, you know, but like they've been getting sick, they've had to retire, they can't come into the prison anymore, so we're trying to bring an influx of new blood. But if you're gonna come in, like, we want some commitment, you know, because it's always like the guys get disappointed when they expect people to show up for them, promise them to be there, and then they're not.
Hi, I'm Peter Hong, editor of Capital in Maine, an investigative news site in Los Angeles. You had said that the news media will kind of take what CDCR says uncritically, and I'm wondering, do you have the ability to correct that through your reporting, or and is it just that you don't have an outlet for that, or are there constraints on your actual ability to do the kind of reporting you know, that would illuminate why the CDCR position is incorrect or the statement is incorrect?
So I'll repeat what I learned one time from Jack Dorsey when he came into the newsroom and talked to us about, you know, Twitter when he first started. And his vision from what he shared was he wanted a platform where people could have freedom of speech and they could have a platform to share their voices. The only thing that he didn't anticipate was the fact that everybody has a right to freedom of speech. Not everybody has a right to freedom of reach. Freedom of reach is bought. So let's say the LA Times publishes something, right? Their circulation and their bandwidth is a whole lot bigger than ours. We only print 40,000 every month. And a lot of those stay within the prison system. So even if we print a correction or if we try to highlight those, we don't have the same type of reach as they do. And if we try to correct them, chances are they're not going to print a redaction unless it's like very factual and they could get in trouble for it. So that accountability model doesn't work, right? And then we don't want to get into, like, I don't know what's a better term than the pissing contest, you know, between them, the state, and us. It's like we should be working together if we're about objectivity and just telling stories that are going to make a difference for our communities. Then I would hope that we could develop those partnerships with outside entities. No, there's no barrier to what we report. It's a matter of, you know, would we be able to get into those publications to have that same platform?
So I want to end here and say thank you very much. Sorry, Rahsaan.
Look all those questions.
I know. It's not me, it's them.
What?
I want to say thank you very much to Rahsaan. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Jesse.
Thank you so much, Rahsaan, Chris, Jesse, Lisa. I mean, that was such a righteous, fearless, inspiring conversation. So now what we're going to do is we're going to split into two groups. If you were paired with a mentor, a Berkeley journalism student for a mentorship session, please meet right outside the auditorium and